The sea had been quiet for weeks. Not calm. Quiet. There was a difference that every fisherman knew. Calm seas still breathed. They shifted, whispered, sighed. This sea did none of that. It lay stretched beneath the sky like a held breath, flat and unresponsive, as if something beneath it was listening. Jonah pushed his boat away from the dock before dawn, the wooden hull creaking softly in protest. The village behind him slept in shadows, nets hanging like tired ghosts from posts, lanterns dark. Once, this harbor had hummed with life, voices calling, gulls screaming, waves slapping against stone. Now there was only the sound of his oars dipping into water that barely rippled. People said the sea had grown tired. Others said it was angry. Jonah said nothing. He hadn't spoken much since the quiet began. He rowed farther than most dared now, past the markers where other fishermen had turned back weeks ago. Their nets came up empty. Their stories grew shorter. Some had stopped going out altogether, choosing hunger over the unease that followed them on the water. But Jonah kept returning. He had fished these waters since he was a boy, guided first by his father's hands over his own, then by memory alone. He knew where the currents should pull, where fish once gathered in silver swarms. Now, his nets sank into emptiness. The sun rose slowly, painting the sky in pale golds and grays. Still the sea did not answer. No birds circled overhead. No fins cut the surface. Even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing the water without conviction. Jonah cast his line anyway. As it sank, he felt it. Not a tug, not resistance, but something like weight. Not physical. Emotional. As if the sea itself pressed back, aware of him, aware of his persistence. He closed his eyes. Years ago, the sea had taken his wife. Not in a storm. Not dramatically. Just one quiet afternoon when she'd gone out alone and never returned. Her boat had been found drifting, untouched, as though she'd simply stepped off the world. After that, Jonah had listened to the sea differently. Not with trust. With caution. With grief. Now, in its silence, he felt that same ache again. The line trembled faintly. Jonah opened his eyes, heart lifting, hands tightening. Slowly, deliberately, he began to pull. The rope came up wet but light, the hook bare. Nothing. He exhaled, long and controlled, and sat back down. Around him, the sea remained still, almost polite in its refusal. "Why?" he whispered, though no one could hear. The words fell flat against the water. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Jonah drifted, oars untouched, allowing the boat to move as the sea permitted, which was barely at all. That was when he noticed something strange. A patch of water ahead of him wasn't reflecting the sky. It wasn't dark. It wasn't deep. It was simply dull, as if the surface there absorbed light instead of returning it. Jonah adjusted his course, unease curling in his stomach. As he approached, the quiet deepened. Even his own breathing sounded intrusive. At the center of the patch floated something small. A buoy. Debris. No. It was a bottle. Glass, weathered smooth, bobbing gently despite the sea's stillness. Jonah reached out and lifted it from the water. Inside was a folded piece of paper, edges browned by time. His fingers hesitated before uncorking it. The note was written in a familiar hand. Not his wife's. His own. The date at the top was from years ago, shortly after she disappeared. Jonah's chest tightened as he read. If the sea goes quiet, it's because it's waiting. It remembers what we refuse to face. Do not ask it for fish. Ask it for the truth. His hands shook. He did not remember writing this, but he remembered the feeling, the sleepless nights, the questions that went unanswered, the part of himself that had hoped the sea might someday respond. A ripple spread outward from the spot where the bottle had floated. Just one. Small. Intentional. Jonah looked up. The sea, for the first time in weeks, moved. The ripple did not fade the way ripples usually did. It widened slowly, deliberately, as if the sea were choosing its words carefully. Jonah stood in his boat, legs braced against the gentle sway, his heart pounding louder than the oars ever had. The surface around him began to shift, not violently, not suddenly, but with purpose. Small movements gathered together, spreading outward like a breath finally released after being held too long. The quiet was breaking. Jonah lowered himself back onto the bench, gripping the edge of the boat as memory pressed in from all sides. The note trembled in his hand. He read it again, slower this time, letting each word settle. Ask it for the truth. He looked out across the water. I don't know how, he said aloud, his voice rough and unused. I don't even know what truth I'm supposed to face. The sea answered without sound. The dull patch of water ahead of him brightened slightly, not with reflection, but with depth. Jonah felt the boat drift forward, pulled not by current but by invitation. He did not resist. 4 years he had lived between questions, surviving on routine, fishing from habit rather than hope. Now, for the first time since his wife vanished, the sea was offering him direction. As the boat crossed into the altered water, Jonah felt it, a sudden heaviness in his chest, like grief resurfacing after being buried too long. Images rose unbidden, his wife standing at the shoreline, laughing as waves soaked the hem of her dress, her hands mending nets beside him, the last argument they'd had, sharp words thrown like careless hooks. You should have come with me, she'd said that day. I'll go tomorrow, he replied. Tomorrow never came. The sea darkened beneath him, not in menace, but in clarity. Jonah understood then what he had avoided all these years. He had blamed the sea because it was easier than blaming himself, easier than admitting that he had chosen routine over love, safety over presence. The sea had not taken her out of cruelty. It had simply kept what he had failed to protect. Jonah dropped the note into the water. It did not sink. Instead, it dissolved, ink unraveling into the sea like veins of smoke, spreading outward until the words were no longer readable, only felt. The water shimmered faintly, and Jonah sensed, not heard, a release. The sea was not waiting for fish. It was waiting for honesty. A wave rose gently beneath the boat, lifting it, rocking it once, twice, almost tenderly. Jonah closed his eyes and let the motion carry him. His breath slowed. The ache in his chest softened, not disappearing, but loosening its grip. I stayed away because I was afraid, he admitted. Afraid to remember. Afraid to feel. The sea responded with movement. Not waves yet, but motion, life stirring beneath the surface. A gull cried out overhead, sudden and sharp, as if the world itself had been holding its breath alongside the water. Jonah opened his eyes. Fish broke the surface nearby, small at first, then more, silver flashes darting through the renewed currents. The sea was waking up, not explosively, but naturally, like something returning to its true rhythm. Jonah laughed then, softly, disbelievingly. It sounded strange in the open air, like a voice long forgotten. He cast his net again, not with expectation, but with respect. The net sank, met resistance, and when he pulled, it came alive with weight. The sea had not punished him. It had waited. By the time Jonah returned to the harbor, the sun was low, painting the water gold. The village stood at the shoreline, watching in stunned silence as his boat approached heavy with catch. Nets were dropped. Voices rose. Hope stirred. But Jonah did not feel victorious. He felt complete. That night, he returned alone to the shore. No nets, no oars, just himself and the water. He stood where his wife had once stood, shoes in hand, waves licking at his feet. "I remember now," he said quietly, "and I won't turn away again." The sea answered with a gentle surge, washing over his ankles, retreating, steady and alive. From that day on, the sea was never silent again, not because it had forgiven him, but because it no longer needed to wait. Jonah fished, yes, but more importantly, he listened. And in listening, he finally learned that some silences exist not to punish, but to prepare us for the truth we're ready to face.